Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Franklin County, Tennessee. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The residents of Cowan, Tennessee still speak in hushed tones about what happened at the old Samota residence in the fall of 1923. Some say the land itself holds memories better left undisturbed. What began as a series of unusual incidents in a remote farmhouse evolved into one of the most perplexing and unsettling cases ever documented in Franklin County records. According to the local newspaper archives recovered from the Franklin County Historical Society, the first official mention of Beatrice Samota appears in the Cowan Weekly Chronicle, dated April 12, 1923. The brief article announced her arrival from Boston, Massachusetts, describing her as a woman of education and refinement who has purchased the old Mercer property on the outskirts of town. What the article failed to mention was why a seemingly well-to-do northern woman would relocate to a dilapidated farmhouse 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. The Mercer property, situated near the base of the Cumberland Mountains, had remained vacant for nearly 7 years before Beatrice's arrival. Local records indicate that the previous owners had departed suddenly, leaving behind most of their belongings. When questioned years later, former neighbors claimed the Mercers had spoken of disturbances in the house, though none could specify exactly what these disturbances entailed. Beatrice Samota was described by those who encountered her as tall and slender, with unusually pale features and dark hair typically worn in a severe bun. Dr. William Harmon, the town physician who would later become inadvertently entangled in the case, noted in his personal journal that she had the most peculiar eyes, almost colorless, like water over stones. She was estimated to be in her mid-30s, though her exact age was never confirmed, as various documents recovered later contained conflicting information. What we know with certainty is that Beatrice arrived in Cowan with 3 large trunks and a collection of scientific equipment that puzzled the railway station employees who helped unload her belongings. According to statements given to local authorities months later, one worker recalled seeing glass containers, brass instruments, and books with foreign writing among her possessions. When asked about her unusual luggage, Beatrice reportedly claimed to be a botanical researcher studying the unique flora of the Cumberland region. For the first few months after her arrival, Beatrice Samota maintained minimal contact with the townspeople. She would visit Cowan once every 2 weeks for supplies, always dressed immaculately in dark clothing despite the summer heat. The proprietor of the general store, Harold Jenkins, later testified that her shopping habits were peculiar and precise. She purchased large quantities of salt, vinegar, and various chemicals that he had to special order from Chattanooga. Jenkins also noted that Beatrice always paid in cash, crisp bills that appeared brand new, despite the economic difficulties many were experiencing in the region. During this period, several residents reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney of the Samota residence at unusual hours, often in the middle of the night. Martha Collins, who lived on a neighboring farm, told Sheriff Blackwood that on at least 3 occasions in May 1923, she observed the smoke to have an unusual bluish tint that she found disturbing enough to mention to her husband. When Mr. Collins suggested they pay a neighborly visit to check on the new resident, Martha reportedly refused, claiming she felt an inexplicable dread at the thought of approaching the house. It wasn't until late August of 1923 that the first truly unusual incident was reported. According to a statement given to Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, a local hunter named James Morrison claimed to have seen strange lights emanating from the Samota property while tracking deer near dusk. Morrison described the illumination as an unnatural bluish glow that seemed to pulse from the windows of the house's basement, a feature unusual for homes in that area. When Morrison approached the property, he reported hearing a rhythmic humming that made him feel dizzy and disoriented. Disturbed by the experience, he retreated back to town. Sheriff Blackwood, according to county records, paid a courtesy visit to the Samota residence the following day. In his official report, he stated that Beatrice appeared composed but guarded, and explained that she often worked late with specialized lamps for her botanical research. The sheriff noted that while he found the woman's manner somewhat off-putting, he observed nothing overtly suspicious to warrant further investigation. This would be the first of 3 official visits the sheriff would make to the property over the next 2 months. In early September, a local farmer reported that several of his livestock had wandered onto the Samota property and returned acting strangely. According to his statement, preserved in Sheriff Blackwood's files, the animals refused to eat for several days and appeared agitated in a way I ain't never seen before. When the farmer himself walked the perimeter of the Samota land to ensure his fence line was secure, he claimed to have experienced a metallic taste in his mouth and developed a severe headache that lasted for nearly 2 days. During this same period, residents on the outskirts of Cowan began to report unusual weather patterns in the vicinity of the Samota property. On clear nights, localized fog would sometimes form around the house, refusing to dissipate until mid-morning. Several witnesses described seeing what they called heat lightning concentrated over the property, even on otherwise clear evenings. The local meteorological records maintained by the railway station for agricultural purposes noted these anomalies, but offered no explanation for them. What happened in mid-September changed everything. On the morning of September 17, 1923, Harold Jenkins became concerned when Beatrice failed to appear for her regularly scheduled supply pickup. After waiting 3 days with her special order gathering dust on his counter, Jenkins mentioned his concern to Sheriff Blackwood, who agreed that such a deviation from her established pattern was unusual. The sheriff, accompanied by his deputy Walter Pierce, traveled to the Samota property to perform a wellness check. What they discovered would become the subject of speculation and hushed conversation for decades to come. According to the official report filed by Sheriff Blackwood, a document that was mysteriously removed from county records in 1965 but preserved in the private collection of Judge Ernest Hamilton until it was rediscovered in 1968, the Samota house appeared undisturbed from the outside. The front door was locked, but a window in the rear of the house had been left partially open. After announcing their presence and receiving no response, the officers entered through this window. The interior of the main floor was described as immaculately maintained but peculiar in its Spartan nature. There was minimal furniture, a single chair at a writing desk in what appeared to be the parlor, a narrow bed in the bedroom with hospital-grade white linens, and a kitchen containing only the most essential implements. What struck the officers as particularly unusual was the complete absence of personal items. There were no photographs, decorative objects, or anything that might indicate the personality or past of the occupant. Deputy Pierce's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1957, contained details absent from the official report. He described finding dozens of small notebooks filled with what appeared to be scientific notations and calculations, arranged in perfect rows on the writing desk. Most disturbing to the deputy was a leather-bound volume labeled simply Transitions that contained detailed anatomical drawings alongside what he described as symbols that resembled mathematical equations but unlike any mathematics I have ever encountered. The basement door, located off the kitchen, was secured with 3 separate locks. Having no key and growing increasingly concerned, Sheriff Blackwood made the decision to force entry. What awaited them below has never been fully explained or understood. The basement of the Samota house had been converted into what the sheriff described as a laboratory of some sort. The walls had been lined with metal sheeting. Long tables held glass containers of varying sizes, each meticulously labeled with scientific notations. A complex apparatus of glass tubing connected several large vessels. Most disturbing, according to the report, was a large metal tank in the center of the room that emitted a low humming sound, despite there being no obvious source of electricity connected to the property. The air in the basement was described as unusually cold and bearing an odor similar to that of electrical equipment after extensive use. Deputy Pierce noted in his journal that despite the coolness of the air, the metal sheeting on the walls felt warm to the touch. Both officers reported experiencing a sensation of pressure in their ears, similar to what one might feel at high altitude. Of Beatrice Samota herself, there was no immediate sign. Her disappearance might have remained the primary mystery had Deputy Pierce not noticed something unusual about the far wall of the basement. Unlike the other walls, which were covered in metal sheeting, this wall appeared to be constructed of a different material altogether, something Deputy Pierce described as having an almost organic quality, like hardened leather. Upon closer examination, Sheriff Blackwood discovered that this was not a wall at all, but rather a carefully constructed barrier made from what appeared to be preserved organic material. The exact nature of this material was not specified in the official report, though later forensic analysis would raise disturbing possibilities. Behind this barrier they discovered a hidden chamber accessible through a narrow opening. It was within this chamber that they found what remained of Beatrice Samota. According to the heavily redacted medical examiner's report, Beatrice was found in a state that defied conventional explanation. She was seated in a chair facing a small desk upon which sat an open journal. Her body showed no signs of trauma or violence, yet the medical examiner noted that her condition was consistent with someone who had been deceased for several weeks, despite the absence of expected decomposition. Most peculiar was the state of preservation. Dr. Harmon, who was called to the scene to assist the medical examiner, wrote in his private journal that Beatrice's body appeared to have undergone some manner of transformation that he could not explain through any medical knowledge available to him. He noted that her skin had taken on a texture similar to parchment, and that there was evidence of systematic replacement of bodily fluids with an unidentified solution. Perhaps the most disturbing detail, one that was omitted from all official documentation, but later revealed in Dr. Harmon's private correspondence with a colleague at Vanderbilt University, was the condition of Beatrice's eyes. According to this letter, dated October 3, 1923, her eyes were not only open when they found her, but appeared to be in a state of movement behind the lids, as though engaged in rapid eye movement sleep. When Dr. Harmon attempted to close her eyelids during his initial examination, he reported that they resisted in a manner suggesting some continued muscular activity, a phenomenon that should have been impossible, given her apparent deceased state. The journal found on the desk provided some insights, though many questions remain unanswered. Written in Beatrice's precise handwriting, the final entries detailed experiments involving cellular suspension and the preservation of consciousness beyond conventional parameters. The journal referenced earlier work conducted at the Institute, believed by some researchers to be the controversial Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, though this connection has never been conclusively established. One particularly unsettling entry, dated September 10, 1923, read, "The electrical measurements continue to show activity even after cessation of respiration in the subject. This confirms my hypothesis that consciousness is not dependent on conventional biological processes, but can be maintained through alternative mechanisms. The next phase will require direct human application. As I am the only suitable subject available, I will proceed with the protocol on myself." What followed in the wake of this discovery was equally disturbing. According to Sheriff Blackwood's personal correspondence, discovered among his effects after his death in 1936, representatives from an unidentified government agency arrived in Cowan less than 48 hours after his report was filed. These men, who presented credentials that Blackwood described as official but vague, took possession of all materials from the basement laboratory, including Beatrice's journal and the remains themselves. A telegram sent by Sheriff Blackwood to the Tennessee State Police, dated September 20, 1923, requested verification of the federal agent's authority. The response, received the following day, advised him to extend all courtesies to the Bureau representatives and cease local investigation immediately. No specific bureau or agency was named in this communication. The house was sealed, and the local authorities were instructed to list the case as resolved due to natural causes. The official death certificate, filed on September 22, 1923, stated simply that Beatrice Samota had died of heart failure, a conclusion that Dr. Harmon refused to endorse, leading to a notable absence of his signature on the document. For months after the incident, residents near the Samota property reported unusual occurrences. Margaret Wilson, whose farm was located 2 miles east of the house, claimed to have heard a woman's voice calling out numbers late at night, despite the property being vacant. Thomas Green, who worked as a railway station master, reported seeing lights in the basement windows on at least 3 occasions in October of 1923. Most significantly, according to an article in the Chattanooga Daily Times dated November 7, 1923, 3 men identified as scientists from Washington visited the property for 5 consecutive days. Local observers noted that these men brought equipment into the house but removed nothing. After their final visit, the house was boarded up and signs were posted prohibiting trespassing due to structural concerns. In December of 1923, a hunting party reported that their dogs refused to approach within 100 yards of the property, becoming agitated and unmanageable when forced to do so. That same month, a severe winter storm caused significant damage to many structures in the area, but photographs taken for insurance purposes show the Samota house completely unaffected, despite its exposed position on the hillside. The property remained abandoned until 1927, when, under mysterious circumstances, the house and surrounding land were purchased by a shell company, later traced to government holdings. In March of that year, the structure was demolished and the foundation filled in with concrete. An anonymous source within the county clerk's office told the Nashville Banner that all records pertaining to the property had been removed from public files. During the demolition, according to statements given by workers involved in the process, unusual precautions were taken. The men were required to wear protective gear that included rubber gloves and masks, equipment uncommon for standard demolition work in that era. Most strange was the requirement that all material from the basement be placed in sealed metal containers before removal from the site. These containers were loaded onto unmarked government trucks and transported away under armed guard. The author, writing under the pseudonym A Former Colleague, described experiments conducted at an unnamed facility in Massachusetts between 1917 and 1922, involving the prolongation of cellular viability and consciousness transfer methodologies. While never directly referencing Beatrice Samota, the articles contained several veiled references to field testing in an isolated southern location and unexpected autonomic continuation after cessation of conventional life functions. The author described a theoretical procedure whereby the human nervous system could be separated from its dependence on respiratory and circulatory functions through a combination of chemical preservation and electrical stimulation. The case might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for a series of articles published in the Scientific American in 1935. The goal, according to the articles, was not the crude extension of life as commonly understood, but rather the liberation of consciousness from its biological constraints, a concept that the author claimed had been successfully demonstrated under laboratory conditions. These articles caught the attention of Professor Edgar Wilson of Vanderbilt University, who began an investigation into unusual scientific activities reported in rural Tennessee during the early 1920s. His research led him to Cowan and the story of Beatrice Samota. According to Wilson's notes, preserved in the Vanderbilt University archives, he managed to locate and interview several witnesses to the original investigation, including Deputy Pierce, who had by then retired from law enforcement. Pierce's account as recorded by Wilson, contained details absent from the official record. He described the hidden chamber in the basement as having walls covered in symbols and equations that made his eyes hurt to look at directly. He also mentioned that when they discovered Beatrice's body, they observed what appeared to be thin copper wires connecting her head to the apparatus on the laboratory tables, a detail omitted from all official reports. Most disturbing was Pierce's claim that as they were removing Beatrice's remains from the basement, he distinctly heard what sounded like a sigh, like someone exhaling after holding their breath too long, despite the fact that by all medical standards she had been deceased for some time. Even more unsettling was his insistence that during the transfer of her body to the medical examiner's facility, he observed what he described as a subtle movement of her fingers, as though attempting to form a gesture or signal. Pierce admitted in the interview that he had not included this observation in his official report because he feared it would damage his credibility. Professor Wilson also discovered that in the weeks following the incident, these samples, according to a laboratory analysis commissioned by Harmon and conducted by a former colleague at Johns Hopkins University, contained anomalous cellular structures and electrical properties inconsistent with known biological materials. The analysis noted that the cells appeared to be in a state of suspended animation rather than true death, and possessed regenerative capabilities not previously documented in human tissue. Wilson's investigation further revealed that Beatrice Samota's connection to Danvers State Hospital was more significant than initially believed. Harmon had collected blood and tissue samples from the basement chamber before the federal agents arrived. According to personnel records that Wilson was able to access through academic connections, Beatrice had not been merely a research assistant, but rather a leading figure in a classified research program funded by an unnamed government entity. This program, according to internal memos that Wilson cited in his notes, was focused on the exploration of consciousness beyond conventional biological parameters, and had been initiated as a response to the unprecedented psychological trauma observed in veterans of the First World War. Professor Wilson's investigation came to an abrupt end in November of 1936. According to university records, he took an unexpected leave of absence, citing health concerns. He never returned to his position, and inquiries by colleagues revealed that he had relocated to Arizona. All his research materials related to the Samota case were found to have been removed from his office. A former student who visited Wilson in 1938 reported that the professor refused to discuss the case, appearing agitated and fearful when the subject was raised. What happened to Wilson after his relocation remains a matter of speculation. His death certificate, filed in Tucson, Arizona in 1941, listed the cause as cerebral hemorrhage. However, a nurse who attended him during his final days later wrote to a former colleague at Vanderbilt, expressing concern about the unusual nature of his decline. According to her letter, Wilson experienced progressive neurological symptoms that began after he received a package containing what he described as materials related to my previous research. Most notably, she reported that in his final days, Wilson repeatedly claimed to be receiving transmissions from what he called the transformed consciousness. In 1947, a historical survey of Franklin County conducted by the Tennessee Historical Commission made brief mention of the Samota case, describing it as an unusual death with circumstances suggesting possible scientific misconduct. This reference was removed from subsequent printings of the survey. A commission member who inquired about the alteration was informed that the change had been made at the request of the State Department of Health due to factual inaccuracies, though no specific inaccuracies were identified. The case resurfaced briefly in 1953 when construction workers preparing to expand the nearby highway uncovered what was described in county records as scientific apparatus of unknown purpose, approximately half a mile from where the Samota house had stood. One of the workers, Joseph Miller, later described the discovered equipment as including glass containers with preserved tissue samples and a device resembling a radio transmitter, but with unusual components. Miller claimed that after the discovery, he and his colleagues were questioned extensively by men who identified themselves as government agents and were required to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of national security implications. Perhaps the most significant development came in 1962 when a retired military physician named Dr. According to statements given by the workers, the equipment was quickly confiscated by individuals claiming to represent the Tennessee Department of Health. No record of this confiscation exists in state files. Robert Lawrence published a paper in an obscure medical journal detailing experiments allegedly conducted by government scientists in the 1920s. The paper, titled Cellular Stasis and Bioelectric Continuity: Unauthorized Experiments in Human Preservation, described attempts to use electrical stimulation and chemical treatments to maintain neural activity after clinical death. While the paper never explicitly mentioned Beatrice Samota, it described a case study involving a female researcher who volunteered for field testing in 1923 that bears striking similarities to the events in Cowan. According to Dr. Lawrence's paper, the experiments were predicated on the theory that human consciousness could exist independently of biological processes if provided with an alternative mechanism for electrical activity. The paper described a procedure whereby the brain and nervous system were gradually infused with a preservative solution while simultaneously being connected to an external power source. The goal, according to the documentation cited by Lawrence, was to create a transitional state in which consciousness could be maintained despite the cessation of conventional life functions. Most disturbing was Lawrence's claim that the experiment had been partially successful, with evidence of continued neural activity and possible conscious awareness for several weeks after clinical death had occurred. The paper concluded with the ominous statement that the ethical implications of creating a consciousness trapped between conventional life and death states were not fully considered by the researchers involved. Dr. Lawrence's paper was retracted within weeks of publication, and the journal itself ceased operations shortly thereafter. Attempts by medical historians to locate Dr. Lawrence have proven unsuccessful, leading some to speculate that the name was a pseudonym. A former colleague who requested anonymity claimed that Lawrence had accessed classified documents during his military service and had published the paper out of concern for ethical violations that had been concealed from the public. In 1965, a request filed under the Freedom of Information Act by the Nashville Tennesseans seeking documents related to federal activities in Franklin County during 1923 was denied on grounds of national security. A subsequent appeal was likewise rejected, with the additional notation that no records responsive to this request exist within governmental archives. This denial came despite multiple witness accounts confirming the presence of federal agents in connection with the Samota case. In 1968, Judge Ernest Hamilton's personal archives were donated to the Franklin County Historical Society following his death. Among these papers was the original copy of Sheriff Blackwood's report, which had been removed from official records in 1965. The report contained several pages of detailed notes that had not been included in the official filing, including sketches of the equipment found in the basement and transcriptions of several pages from Beatrice's journal. These transcriptions revealed that Beatrice may not have been working alone. She made repeated references to correspondents who were expecting regular updates on her progress. She also mentioned deliveries of specialized materials that arrived via non-standard channels. Most disturbing were her final entries, which suggested that she had reached a critical stage in her research. The transition approaches. The physical vessel has been adequately prepared, and the connections are stable. I have observed successful transfer in the smaller subjects, though duration remains limited. I believe the human nervous system will prove more resilient and adaptive. Tomorrow, I will initiate the final protocol. If my calculations are correct, consciousness will persist beyond the cessation of conventional biological functions. I will continue to record observations for as long as the mechanism allows. This was the final entry in her journal, dated September 14, 1923, 3 days before Sheriff Blackwood and Deputy Pierce discovered her body. An earlier entry, dated August 27, 1923, provided additional context for her work. The conventional understanding of death is fundamentally flawed. What we perceive as the end is merely a transition between states of consciousness. The physical body is not the seat of the self, but merely a vessel. With the correct application of electrical stimulation and chemical preservation, the connection between consciousness and its material anchor can be maintained indefinitely. The implications are profound, not immortality as commonly understood, but a transformation of existence beyond current human comprehension. The rediscovery of these documents prompted renewed interest in the case. In 1969, investigative journalist William Carter attempted to piece together a comprehensive account of the Samota incident for a planned book. His research took him to archives in Boston, where he discovered records indicating that a Beatrice Samota had indeed been employed at Danvers State Hospital from 1917 to 1922 as a research assistant in a department devoted to neurological studies. Personnel records described her as extraordinarily dedicated, but noted concerns about increasingly unorthodox methodologies and ethical boundaries. Carter's investigation revealed that Beatrice had been born in Hungary in 1889 and had immigrated to the United States as a child. She had studied chemistry and biology at Radcliffe College, graduating with honors in 1910. Her academic records indicated a particular interest in neurological research, with her thesis focusing on electrical properties of neural tissue outside the living organism. After graduation, she worked briefly at Massachusetts General Hospital before being recruited to Danvers State Hospital in 1917. What Carter found particularly intriguing was a gap in Beatrice's employment records at Danvers between June and November of 1921. During this period, according to a colleague's personal correspondence that Carter uncovered, Beatrice had been temporarily assigned to a research facility in Washington, D.C. The nature of this assignment was not specified, but upon her return, several colleagues noted that her research had taken a decidedly different direction, focusing increasingly on what one memorandum described as the persistence of electrical activity in neural tissue after clinical death. Carter's investigation came to an unexpected halt when he suffered a severe stroke in January 1970. While he survived, he experienced significant cognitive impairment and was unable to continue his work. His collected research materials were stored in his home office in Memphis until a house fire in 1974 reportedly destroyed everything. The book was never completed. Strangely, in a brief period of lucidity shortly before his death in 1976, Carter reportedly told his nurse that his stroke had not been natural but rather induced through methods developed in 1923. The nurse dismissed this as confusion related to his condition. The most recent significant development in the case occurred in 1968, when a geology student from the University of Tennessee discovered an unusual rock formation near the site where the Samota house had stood. Embedded within this formation was what appeared to be a small metal box. Inside was a single sheet of paper preserved within a sealed glass container. The paper contained what appeared to be the continuation of Beatrice's journal entries, though the authenticity of this document has been questioned. The text read, "Day 3 after transition, perception continues though altered. The vessel no longer responds to conventional stimuli, but consciousness persists. I can observe, but not interact. The mechanism functions as designed, though I did not anticipate the sensation of disconnection. I hear them above, searching. They will find only what I have left behind. The true experiment continues." A second entry, dated simply Day 7, stated, "The preservation solution is maintaining cellular integrity as expected. Electrical activity continues through the external mechanism. I have discovered that with concentration, I can influence small electrical fields in my proximity. This suggests that consciousness, once freed from biological constraints, may interact with the physical world in ways previously unimagined. The implications are profound and disturbing. The final entry, labeled Day 12, contained a more troubling observation. I am not alone here. There are others who have undergone the transition, some voluntarily, others not. We exist in a state between conventional definitions of life and death. I believe the government researchers suspect this possibility, but cannot prove it. They will continue their work, creating more like us. We wait, we observe, and eventually, we will find a way to communicate our existence. The student turned the document over to his professor, who contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. According to university records, the document was confiscated by federal authorities within hours. The student later reported being questioned extensively about the exact location of his discovery and was advised not to discuss the matter publicly. Within weeks, he transferred to another university and has consistently refused to comment on the incident in the decades since. In the years following this discovery, several researchers attempting to investigate the site have reported unusual equipment malfunctions and unexplained health symptoms. In 1969, a team from Georgia Tech, conducting a geological survey of the area, experienced complete failure of all electronic equipment within a half-mile radius of the former Samota property. The team leader later reported developing severe migraines and short-term memory loss that persisted for several weeks after their visit. In 1971, a paranormal investigation group attempting to conduct an unauthorized exploration of the site reported hearing what they described as voices speaking in numerical sequences that were captured on their audio recording equipment. The quality of these recordings was poor, but analysis by a linguistics professor from the University of Tennessee identified the cadence and pattern as consistent with Hungarian speech, though the content was unintelligible. When this analysis was published in a small paranormal research journal, the professor reportedly received a visit from individuals claiming to represent the Federal Communications Commission, who confiscated the original recordings. In the decades since, the case of Beatrice Samota has been largely forgotten outside of local folklore in Franklin County. The location where her house once stood remains undeveloped, a small clearing surrounded by trees that have grown unusually dense considering the relatively short time span. Locals avoid the area, claiming that electronic devices malfunction when brought too close to the site. GPS mapping services show an unusual distortion in aerial imagery of the location. Those who have researched the case in depth note several disturbing patterns. Multiple individuals who investigated the incident experienced sudden health issues, relocations, or unexplained cessation of their work. Documents related to the case have a tendency to disappear from archives or become altered in subsequent viewings. Perhaps most tellingly, no photographs of Beatrice Samota have ever been located, despite the usual documentation practices of both Danvers State Hospital and Franklin County officials. In 1978, an amateur historian named Robert Mitchell attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the Samota case based on available public records. His self-published monograph, titled The Cowan Incident: Science Beyond Ethics, received little attention at the time, but contained several intriguing observations. Mitchell noted that over the decades, at least 7 different individuals who had investigated aspects of the case had experienced similar symptoms: severe headaches, electrical sensitivity, and recurring dreams featuring numbers and equations. Mitchell himself reported developing these same symptoms during his research and abandoned the project shortly after publication. Perhaps most disturbing was Mitchell's discovery that between 1923 and 1968, 6 different women matching Beatrice Samota's general description had been briefly employed in various scientific institutions across the United States. Each had worked at their respective institutions for less than 6 months before disappearing, and each had been involved in research related to neurological function or electrical properties of biological systems. Employment records for these women contained notable inconsistencies, including conflicting birth dates and educational backgrounds. What truly happened in that isolated farmhouse in 1923 may never be fully understood. The official record states simply that a woman died of natural causes in a remote location. Yet the fragments of evidence that have survived suggest something far more disturbing: experiments that crossed the boundaries between life and death, consciousness that persisted beyond its natural limits, and, possibly, a transformation that scientific knowledge of the time could not explain. In 1968, an elderly resident of Cowan named Mary Jenkins, the daughter of general store owner Harold Jenkins, gave a brief statement to a local historian. She recalled seeing Beatrice Samota on her final visit to the store in early September 1923. There was something different about her that day, Mary stated. Her movements were too precise, like she had to think about each one before making it. And her eyes, they didn't look right. Not like they were damaged, but like what was looking through them wasn't the same person I'd seen before. Mary further recalled that during this visit, Beatrice had purchased an unusual combination of items: batteries, copper wire, and a large quantity of salt. When Harold Jenkins had commented on the unusual order, Beatrice had responded with what Mary described as a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and explained that she was conducting an experiment in electrical conductivity. As she was leaving the store, Mary claimed to have overheard Beatrice muttering what sounded like, "Soon there will be no need for this pretense." The site where the Samota house once stood is now part of a protected wilderness area. Access is restricted due to environmental concerns. Attempts by researchers to conduct soil analysis or ground-penetrating radar studies have been consistently denied by authorities. The most recent application, filed in 1968 by a team from Johns Hopkins University, was rejected with the unusual notation, "Area contains unstable subterranean structures unsuitable for research activities." In 1981, a former employee of the U.S. Department of Energy, speaking on condition of anonymity, claimed that the site remained under active monitoring by government agencies. According to this source, sensitive equipment designed to detect electrical anomalies had been installed throughout the area in the late 1960s and was regularly maintained by personnel operating under the cover of Forest Service employees. The source suggested that these monitoring activities were connected to what he described as the Transition Protocol, a classified research program that had allegedly continued the work initiated by Beatrice Samota. Every few years, someone with knowledge of the case attempts to reopen the investigation or publish a comprehensive account. Invariably, these efforts are abandoned before completion. The last serious attempt was made by historian Rebecca Morgan in 1968, whose planned academic paper on rural scientific experimentation in the early 20th century was never published. When contacted by interested colleagues, Dr. Morgan claimed to have lost interest in the subject, despite having devoted over 2 years to the research. In a particularly strange development, in 1985, a package containing what appeared to be original photographs from the Samota investigation was anonymously delivered to the Franklin County Historical Society. These images, which included photos of the basement laboratory and what appeared to be Beatrice Samota herself, were examined by the Society's curator for less than 24 hours before being confiscated by individuals claiming to represent the FBI. The curator later reported that, while in possession of the photographs, she experienced what she described as a persistent whispering voice reciting what sounded like mathematical formulas. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Samota case is not what we know, but what remains hidden. The fragments that have emerged over the decades suggest a discovery or development that someone considered important enough to conceal for nearly half a century. In 1993, a declassified document from 1924 was discovered in the National Archives that made brief reference to an incident in Tennessee that had demonstrated the theoretical viability of consciousness persistence. The document, which appeared to be a status report on a classified research program, concluded with the recommendation that further field experiments be suspended pending the development of more sophisticated containment protocols. This document represents one of the few official acknowledgments, however oblique, that the events in Cowan may have had broader implications than a simple, isolated death. Whether this concealment was motivated by scientific ethics, national security, or something else entirely remains a matter of speculation. As for Beatrice Samota herself, who she really was, what she discovered, and whether her experiments achieved their intended purpose, these questions may never be fully answered. Her official grave in the Cowan Cemetery contains a simple marker with her name and the years 1889 to 1923. Local caretakers report that despite the absence of any known relatives, fresh flowers appear on the grave every year on September 17th, the anniversary of her discovery. When questioned, none of the local florists claim responsibility for the deliveries. In 1968, during routine maintenance of the cemetery grounds, workers attempted to relocate Beatrice's headstone to facilitate lawn care. According to their report, upon attempting to move the stone, they discovered that it was attached to an unusual metal plate that extended deep into the ground. More disturbing was their claim that when the plate was disturbed, they heard what sounded like a faint electrical humming emanating from the grave. Cemetery officials quickly ordered the stone to be left in place and added the plot to a list of sites exempt from routine maintenance. In the mountains of Franklin County, where mist often shrouds the land where the Samota house once stood, some claim that on particularly quiet nights they can hear a faint humming, rhythmic and unnatural, emanating from the earth itself. Others dismiss such claims as mere folklore, the kind that inevitably surrounds unusual events in rural communities. What remains undeniable is that something occurred in that isolated farmhouse in 1923, something that defied conventional explanation, and that certain parties have gone to extraordinary lengths to keep hidden. The truth, like Beatrice herself, seems to exist in a state between revelation and concealment, neither fully alive in public knowledge, nor completely dead and forgotten. And perhaps that liminal state is the most fitting legacy for a woman who, according to her own writings, sought to transcend the fundamental boundaries between life and death. In the words of Sheriff Blackwood, written in a private letter to his sister shortly before his death, "Some doors once opened can never truly be closed again. What came through may still be walking among us, wearing a familiar face, but housing something altogether different within." The case of Beatrice Samota remains officially closed. The questions it raises continue to echo across time, like the mysterious humming from a basement laboratory that should have fallen silent long ago. In 1968, during an unusually severe electrical storm, multiple residents of Cowan reported seeing a blue glow emanating from the direction of the old Samota property. The following morning, a local farmer discovered that a section of ground had subsided, revealing what appeared to be a metal structure beneath. 2 weeks after this incident, 3 residents who had witnessed the blue glow reported experiencing the same dream. A woman with pale features and dark hair, speaking in what they described as mathematical sequences. All 3 witnesses later developed similar symptoms: sensitivity to electrical fields, persistent headaches, and what one described as the feeling of another presence inside my thoughts. The most recent development in the case occurred in 1968, when a graduate student researching the history of federal scientific research programs discovered references to what was called the Continuity Protocol in partially declassified documents. According to these references, experiments conducted in the early 1920s had demonstrated that human consciousness can persist in a stable matrix independent of biological functions if provided with an appropriate energy source and containment system. The documents further suggested that this research had continued in secret for decades, with significant advancements in consciousness transfer and preservation methodologies. Most disturbing was a brief notation indicating that by 1968, the program had achieved limited success in reintegration of preserved consciousness into new biological vessels, a clinical description that seems to suggest nothing less than the transfer of a preserved consciousness into a new physical body. According to university records, they withdrew from their program shortly after making these discoveries, citing personal reasons. A former classmate later revealed that, in their final conversation, the student had appeared deeply disturbed and had mentioned being approached by government representatives who had advised them to pursue other research interests. The Samota case represents a disturbing intersection of cutting-edge science, government secrecy, and fundamental questions about the nature of human consciousness. Before this discovery could be properly investigated, individuals identifying themselves as federal geological surveyors cordoned off the area and filled the depression with concrete. The graduate student's research was never published. What began as one woman's unorthodox experiments in a remote Tennessee farmhouse may have evolved into something far more significant, a hidden chapter in scientific history with implications that extend well beyond the borders of Franklin County. For those who have studied the case most carefully, one question remains paramount. If Beatrice Samota did indeed succeed in preserving her consciousness beyond the death of her physical body, where does that consciousness reside today? The scattered evidence, the electrical anomalies, the dreams experienced by investigators, the persistent legends of whispering voices and mathematical formulas suggests a disturbing possibility that something of Beatrice Samota continues to exist, neither fully alive nor truly dead, perhaps still observing, still experimenting, still seeking to perfect the transition she began in 1923. As one anonymous source with alleged connections to classified research programs put it in a rare interview granted to a fringe scientific journal in 1968, the Samota incident wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. What she started is still ongoing, still developing. The boundaries between life and death, between one consciousness and another, these aren't as fixed as we once believed. She proved that. And some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. The case remains officially closed. The questions it raises remain officially unanswered. And somewhere, perhaps in the misty mountains of Franklin County, or perhaps much closer than any of us would care to consider, the consciousness that was once Beatrice Samota may still be waiting, watching, and working toward a goal that we can only begin to imagine.